today I intend to apply some new oil to the side of the studio, and as a result I've got to move this shed. I'm going to slide it across, and to do that I've decided I'm going to make some jacks that will fit in this gap between the shed and the brick wall. So the idea is that the jacks will pull the shed towards the wall, and then when I finish, push it back again into its original position. So we can see it's about I think it's 80 centimeters that I need to move it. I don't need to move it quite that much. There's going to be a scissor jack. There's going to be two of them, so one near the front of the shed, one near the back, so that they pull in sync. And I'm going to join the threaded rods that drive them together so that I can do the whole lot. I'm hoping to power it with an electric drill rather than putting some sort of complicated handle on. And I'm going to make it out of scrap material that's in the shed. This may mean I need to take a few compromises, but anyway, here's the idea. So I'm going to have 4 main arms. Let's see if I can draw something here to point them out a little bit. Whoops, not that. 4 main arms down these, and these are going to be drilled with pivot points, and then so that I can form them into the relevant shape, I need some hinges, so to speak. So I need 2 pieces of scrap material for the one edge of it, and 2 pieces of scrap material to attach it to the walls of the shed and the garage. If we look at this in its sort of assembly form, we can see that the threaded rod passes through one of these small blocks, which is threaded. So the rod will move backwards and forwards in this as we turn it. On the other side, there's the other block. It's been drilled through, but the threaded rod is free to rotate in that, but it can't slide in and out because we're going to put 2 captive sort of washers or nuts or something on those, so that it just stays where it is. So as this threaded rod rotates, this point here, this one just there, will go in and out on the rod, lengthening and shortening the distance between these 2 points, and as a result the 2 sides will either pull in together or outwards. Now for pulling the shed, this center section sort of here will be under compression, so that means that it will want to bend. So ideally I need a really quite a chunky threaded rod, and it ideally wants to be high tensile as well, so it doesn't tend to bend quite so much. M16 is what I thought I had in the shed, but I've actually only got M10, so that's what I'll use. I think it's probably not enough, but we'll give it a go, see what happens. Okay, and I'll also need to sort of pre-drill these as well, so that they'll fasten to the wall on the shed fairly easily. I've got loads of bits of metal kicking around. I'm going to use angle line for these long arms. I'm just going to use a little bit of box section for the fasteners to the wall and the sort of hinges. Ideally, these hinges would be kind of like a large circular block with a single hole, so that there's only a single pivot point, because these can tend to twist and that'll make the threaded rod harder to drive. But you know, we've got what we've got in the scrap bin, so that's what we're going to use. So I've moved outside. I've got a wheelbarrow full of scrap metal and bits and pieces that I might need, just some angle line and some square section, and I'm going to cut it on this old band saw, which is quite a useful little tool. I'm not going to be ultra precise. Here's a bit of angle line I'm going to use, and you can see it's just a bit of scrap that's come off something else. And I'm going to quickly measure up 400 millimeters, 40 centimeters. Don't know what that is in inches, and hopefully that will be fine. So just dropping the blade down so I can see it against the tape measure there, and we tighten it up, remove the tape measure, turn it on. And as you can see, it makes pretty short work. The little bit of smoke that's coming off is because I do have a little bit of lubricant on the blade, and I just touch that up occasionally. And there we have it. Just a lot more to do. So I've got all my pieces on the bench now. So 8 of the main arms. And these are all cleaned up briefly on the grinder, just touching the edges up so there's no sharp pieces at all. So 8 of those, 4 of these short pieces which are going to be the pivot points, and 4 of these larger pieces which are going to go on the wall. And you can see here that they will also have a pivot point in them. Short pieces go on the other end, and that makes up the diamond shape that we need. Now these are pretty much the same length. You can see that within 0.5 millimetre or so they're all the same. And I now need to drill 8.5 millimetre holes through them all so that I can fit them on a pivot pin, which will be a piece of it'll be an 8 millimetre high tensile bolt. So this is an M8 bolt that will go through a hole in the box section, and because it's in the box section, that will stop it tilting from side to side, through a hole in this, and there'll be a washer on either side and a nut on the top, and that will then be the hinge for it. So I just need a lot of 8.5 millimetre holes to accept this nut, and ideally I would like them all the same distance in and from the end so that everything comes up symmetrical. For that purpose I have made this. So this is just a piece of scrap wood. It's got a notch cut, a section cut in this side, which will fit into there, and you can see they've got a notch cut in the opposite direction, which is where the hole punch will go. So using this, I should, fingers crossed, be able to hole punch quite a lot of these quite quickly, and know that they are all in the right place. In regards to these smaller pieces, I'm going to need to drill a hole to the centre, which is where the threaded rod is going to pass, and then turning this to right angles, I need to drill 2 points for the pivots of these. Now I want those to be quite close together, because otherwise, as I tighten and loosen things, this is going to try and twist. So the further apart I put the 2 pivot points on these, the more twist it will tend to have. So I'm just going to roughly run a line down the centre. This doesn't need to be exact in any way. So this is just scribing this down the centre. Just force of habit using a square. Okay, and there we go. And I need it to be pretty much central, or pretty much the same at least, in all of them. Now I don't actually mind this being a little bit off to one side, so I'm actually going to use, again, a thin piece of wood. I say off to one side, what I mean by that is I don't need it dead centre. I can actually afford to have it a little bit lower, and that gives me a bit more strength from the wall. So I'm going to use, again, a bit of scrap wood just to measure them all down the same. Scrap wood on the back, that gives me my point. Just a piece I took out the scrap bin. So I'm going to turn this on its side. Do the same again, scribe a line, go this side, scribe another line, and imagine a pivot point in the centre, as you can see, nothing too complicated there. And then I'm just going to kind of have a little look at these and see if that is going to present any problems for me. So I'm just roughly positioning the punch points on the marks that I've just made. I'm going to put them at 45 degrees, and just to see that those corners clear each other really, which they do. So I'll adopt the same approach for the rest of them now. Seem to have already punched these. Right, okay. Punch the other side. So those are all marked and punched. So these are now the end pieces. They're fastened to the shed on the wall. And we need a similar approach to that which I just took, which is I need 2 pivot points on each one, and they want to be slightly towards the front, so you get the strength from the edge, and a similar distance apart to the ones on the thing that I just made, because we know then that the corners clear each other as this is like this. Now, in terms of distance front to back, to avoid having to chop lots off, you see that if I put that central, that actually I have to take that corner off, otherwise it will foul. I don't need to do it on the side pieces. On the pieces up on the wall, if that's the wall, it's going to foul. So I'm going to just try to minimise the amount that I have to cut off these, or round off, by just bringing the actual hole forward a little bit. So to mark it, I just take one of the ones I've already marked. As I said, that was alright, the distance was fine. And we'll just run a go through, and I'm just doing this roughly around the centre point. Okay, so those are all punched, they are pretty much central. So I'm not trying to make these interchangeable. If you're drilling these by hand, you'll want to drill a smaller hole first. Okay, so I've had to modify my plan. So you can see here one of the cross pieces, and it's perfectly alright. It's drilled out with an 8.5mm hole, and this bolt here is actually a coach bolt, so it can actually be pressed in and it just stays where it's meant to be. My plan for the rest was to use normal bolts like this, pop them through, pop a washer on here, and then pop the other piece onto it. So that would be great. Problem. I confidently reached for the packet of bolts and found none. I have got some threaded rod. I have got some nylon lock nuts, which I was planning to use anyway. So what I've done is, with some of these, I've drilled 8.5mm on one side and 6.5 on the other, and I'm actually going to tap those out. And the reason for that is that, particularly for these threaded things, I'll be able to screw these in, screw a lock nut on the other side, and hopefully that will be sufficient to lock everything up without having to weld anything. I'm just going to thread a lot of holes now, and I'll come back to you. Now, because we're working with threaded rod, we're going to run into a difficulty that we need to clamp things in a vise, that is the threaded rod in the vise, while we attach nuts to it and things. And the problem there is, of course, if you grip it tightly in the vise, the thread is destroyed and you can't put nuts on it. So this is a little tip. This is a normal M8 nut, and I'm placing it in the vise, pointy corner upwards. We'll see what that is in a second. Now I'm going to take a file and I'm just going to make a flat on the top. Not a particularly huge one. There we go, it's about 2mm, maybe a bit more across. Take my trusty hacksaw and cut a slot. So I'm trying to do this without getting in the way of the camera. It's quite tricky. And there we go, we're cut. So now you've got a handy tool. So this will relatively easily, you can see the slot there, thread onto a piece of threaded rod now. You then place it, when you want to lock your threaded rod in place in your vise, you place that so the slot is horizontal with the vise, tighten the vise up, the slot closes, that is completely clamped in place and will not turn. When we're finished, we just release it and we can remove the nut from the threaded rod. So here I am assembling the one of the screw ends. This is the free end that stays kind of fixed on the jack as it moves backwards and forwards. And what I'm trying to do is I need to screw these threads in and I need to put the nylock on this end, and that's fine. The problem being, as I turn the nylock, the thread just progresses further through the hole, which is kind of what you expect. So I need to clamp that. So I take the split nut that I made, and I'm just going to pop that on the thread in question, if I can. There it is. Okay, great. And now I can clamp that relatively easily into the vise. And tighten down the nuts. Now what I'm doing with these nuts is I'm tightening down till they are actually tight. The reason for that is it's kind of locking the threads. Not ultra tight, but you know, tight enough that it locks the threads on these ones. So these are no longer free to turn. Okay, so on the bench I'm just starting more of the assembly. So I have a short piece, I've got 2 studs fitted into it, and this is drilled all the way through 10.5, and the M10 rod is all the way through. And despite the fact that it looks like it's bolted, these are actually completely loose. I'm going to have to either glue those to this with a nut locking glue on both sides, or I'm going to have to just do a quick weld. I'm not sure which. The idea is that this end just doesn't move. It stays fixed on that point on the threaded rod. This end does move. This is actually threaded, so as I turn the threaded rod, this section moves in and out. I'm probably going to just put a couple of little welds, one on either side of that nut there, just to hold it in place, just to give it a bit more strength. See how that goes though. I'd rather not weld it because I know a lot of people haven't got welding equipment. So I've just taken the highest gauge the thickest box section that I've got, and I've threaded one side, and I'm crossing my fingers and hoping on that. But I have cleaned this down so that should I need to do a quick weld on there, I can do. Okay, and then we can see that just here we have one of our big cross pieces that has its studs fitted, and I've already fitted the nuts to that, and so it's got a nut through, a washer between the two parts just to reduce the friction a little bit, because otherwise that entire length would be rubbing. Yeah, that's kind of about it really. So now I'm just really going to assemble the other side. So I've finished assembling it, and I've bolted it to the wall with some quite substantial nuts. It actually hooks down below the decking as well, and I'm just starting to turn it to move it in, and the progress is going to be really slow, particularly at the start. And here we start to see the problem with using M10 instead of the M16 that I hoped for. There's something of a bend in, particularly in the far jack, and that's because that's under compression, and we can see it really clearly just then. So I have managed to move the shed enough, but as you can see there is quite an extreme bend in one of the threaded rods now. Studio wall now, and I've started to move the shed back, and I'm just going to kind of show you the end of that. It's a lot more successful moving it back in than it was pulling it out, and that's because the threaded rod is now under tension. So not a total success, but certainly injury free and a lot easier than trying to maneuver this by hand. Hope you enjoyed that, got something from it. Please thumbs up and subscribe if you're able to, that really helps. See you soon.